Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar, Practical Tools to Implement Critical Allyship and Radical Self-Care in Our Service Delivery to Latinx Communities. This is the second episode of a two-part webinar series on this topic. If you were not able to make it to the first half of our series, you can access the recording on our website, which will be provided at the end of this presentation. My name is Maxine Henry, the co-director for the National Hispanic and Latino Addiction Technology Transfer Center. I will be your host for today's webinar. Before I introduce you to today's guest presenter, here are some brief instructions about today's webinar. This webinar will be recorded and archived for future playback. It will also be dubbed or closed captioned in Spanish and eventually also in Portuguese. A copy of today's presentation will also be made available after the webinar. The lines will be muted throughout the presentation so as to minimize background noise and other interference. When we get to the Q&A portion of our webinar, you will have an opportunity to ask questions by clicking the Q&A box, and I will present your questions to our presenter. We will also be asking you to fill out a brief survey at the end of this webinar. The satisfaction evaluation is important to the work we do and provides us the opportunity to improve our training efforts. Although we did not secure continuing education credits for this event, we plan to do so for future events. A certificate of completion can be sent to you upon request via email after the completion of the satisfaction evaluation. So let's begin. Let us start by introducing the National Hispanic and Latino Addiction Technology Transfer Center and our team. The National Hispanic and Latino Addiction Technology Transfer Center is housed at the National Latino Behavioral Health Association, or NLBHA, located in New Mexico. NLBHA was established to fill a need for a unified national voice for Latino populations in the behavioral health arena and to bring attention to the great disparities that exist in the areas of access, utilization, practice-based research, and adequately trained personnel. The NLBHA's executive director is Fred Sandoval. Our ATTC is part of the ATTC network, which is an international multidisciplinary resource for professionals in the addictions, treatment, and recovery services field. Established in 1993 by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, the ATTC network is comprised of 10 domestic regional centers, 6 international HIV centers funded by PEPFAR, 2 national focus area centers, and a network coordinating office. Together, the network serves the 50 U.S. states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the Pacific Islands of Guam, American Samoa, Palau, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and the Mariana Islands. The international HIV ATTCs serve Vietnam, Southeast Asia, South Africa, and Ukraine. Here you will see a map of the US-based ATTCs. The National Hispanic and Latino Addiction Technology Transfer Center has a national focus for Hispanic and Latino communities and the workforce that provides services to these communities. Our ATTC is staffed by Dr. Pierluigi Mancini, our project director. I serve as the project co-director, and Ruth Yanez is our executive administrative assistant. The National Latino Behavioral Health Association is also the home of our sister TTC, the National Hispanic and Latino Prevention Technology Transfer Center. We will provide contact information at the end of this webinar. Our esteemed presenter for today is Anna Nelson, LCSW. She is an educator for the previous decade and has been helping professionals since 1996. She is a college assistant professor with New Mexico State University, or NMSU, School of Social Work, and is a PhD candidate in educational leadership and administration. Ms. Nelson employs mixed methods participatory action research grounded in critical race and intersectionality theories to understand cultural, cumulative, and collective trauma and its impact on communities with a strong focus on identity-driven resilience and resistance. From 2010 to 2016, she served as executive director of the New Mexico Forum for Youth and Community, a statewide network intermediary that promoted racial, health, academic, and economic justice for all youth statewide. Our professional practice emphases are youth, family, and community engagement, violence prevention, trauma healing informed, culturally sustaining service systems development, and policy transformation, particularly for child welfare and juvenile justice systems. Ms. Nelson is a Robert Wood Johnson Ladder to Leadership Fellow for her work in successfully reducing the rate of teen dating violence in New Mexico. Ms. Nelson was the recipient of the 2011 Patty Jennings and Polly Arango Citizen Advocacy Award. For her work in promoting social justice and equity in education, Ms. Nelson is the recipient of the New Mexico Education Equity Alliance 2013 Annual Fueling Increasingly Relevant Education Award and the YWCA NM Women on the Move to Eliminate Racism Award in 2015. Well, we are absolutely honored to have you here again today, Anna. Internally, we are so excited about this presentation, and we are so happy to be able to present this. So go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here today. And Ruth, next slide, please. I'm incredibly humbled to join you all today, and it was an incredible honor as well in December to present on an emerging theory called critical trauma theory, on which we'll build from today to really create some practical, pragmatic skills and tools out in community serving Latinx individuals who are impacted by substance use. So I always, it's important, I believe, to begin every dialogue with the opportunity to acknowledge the land and the opportunity for me to be here as a guest in presenting here in New Mexico. So a land acknowledgement, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous First Nations peoples as traditional stewards of this land and their enduring relationship that exists with traditional territories. So today I would really like to honor and express my gratitude to the 23 tribes and pueblos here in New Mexico. This is where I live and work, and I'm humbled by the opportunity to present this information as a guest on these lands. And this land acknowledgement is just one small step in the ongoing process of working to be in good relationship with the land and the people of the land. And I also feel it's really important to share who I am so that you all know where this information is emerging from. So, thank you, Maxine, for such a warm welcome. I'm also a mother of a multi-ethnic son. I myself am multi-ethnic with Portuguese heritage. And so these are dialogues that happen, every day in my household and in my community. So this is emerging from my learnings out in the field and from dear colleagues, community members, people I've been in service to, and the elders who've been doing this work much longer than me. And I would also like to dedicate this presentation to my mother who passed from opioid addiction. So thank you again for this opportunity. So I have, webinars are always an interesting thing, and I wish that there was more of an opportunity to interact. And so I want to welcome you all at the end of the presentation. My contact information is provided. So if questions emerge that aren't able to be answered today, please feel free to reach out to me, and we can start a dialogue through email as well as connecting in other ways. So my aspirations for this dialogue today is to just ground ourselves again, if you were able to attend the first webinar, in critical trauma theory. If this is new information to you, I'll be introducing critical trauma theory today and its application in substance use treatment. And there's also utility within prevention, and that can be, weaved into this dialogue as well. Also today, I felt it was really important that we walk away feeling as if we have concrete strategies where we can apply critical trauma theory, both at our personal levels in our own healing and our own self-work, as well as at the professional level to create safety through community agreements, counter storytelling through testimonials, meaning-making interventions through photo voice, and finally, acting as critical allies to one another as we disrupt systems of oppression. And then at the very end, there will be an opportunity, there's a framework for creating your own personalized action plan to apply some of these principles. Okay, so in review, critical trauma theory is emerging as an opportunity to expand our understanding of what's considered now trauma-informed work. And so trauma-informed work, a body of literature, has been emerging for the previous few decades. And we're really hoping through the introduction of this critical trauma theory based in critical race theory that we can expand our understanding of the depth and complexity of oppression-based trauma. So to begin that, it's important for us to just have a foundational understanding of what oppression-based trauma is. So this definition is a little long, but I hope it captures most experiences that we and the people we serve have endured. So exposure to and lived experiences of personally mediated, that's one person to another person, institutional and structural forms of oppression. And this can happen through symbolic, emotional, verbal, physical, sexual, or economic manifestations across one's lifespan. Oppression-based trauma exposure includes, but is not limited to, linguicism, which we'll talk a lot about today actually, colorism, racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, colonialism, political, historical, and intergenerational trauma, and finally acts of oppression because of one's immigration or refugee or former incarceration status. So beyond what we as folks working out in the field in service to others, beyond what we understand as individual trauma, which is a blow to the psyche that breaks through one's defenses in a really sudden and brutal way, the important kind of takeaway from this slide is that oppression-based trauma also includes collective, cumulative, and cultural forms of trauma. So important to note about collective trauma, that's a blow to the basic tissue of social life. It damages the bonds attaching people together and may impair the prevailing sense of community. So that has a long-term impact. Cumulative is exactly what it sounds like. It's the multiple exposure to traumatic events over time where persons impacted experienced high degrees of stress associated with these traumas. And finally, cultural trauma is an invasive and overwhelming event that is believed to undermine several key aspects of a culture. So critical trauma theory itself, we kind of explored this, but trauma theory as it stands now in our respective fields really analyzes the impact of emotional trauma on individuals, specifically individuals, and then its correlation with risk for substance use, and other health issues. So important to note though here is that we don't really understand well the cumulative cultural and collective forms of trauma in Latinx individuals and communities. These gaps are really important and they're worthy of exploration for a number of reasons. And of course, the literature affirms what we already know at the community level, which is that microaggressions, racism, sexism, and homophobia are all correlated with risk for emotional trauma and poor health outcomes. So critical trauma theory was then created to help to address this gap. So how I kind of developed this information, and hopefully this is a helpful framework, is I wanted to take a look at what we as practitioners and providers in the community and as people who are also experiencing potentially oppression-based trauma, what it looks like for our own well-being at the self-care level as well as the professional level. So I divided our dialogue into two distinct pieces, what we can do at the personal level and then how we can then expand it out to our work professionally. So why is it so important to look at radical healing and self-care? And so throughout the slides, you'll notice that abbreviated as RHSC. So radical healing and self-care for us as substance use treatment providers serving Latinx communities and clients, specifically substance use among Latinx is closely correlated with the presence of post-traumatic stress syndrome. In addition to that, people impacted by substance use disorders also report this co-occurrence, happening at the same time of trauma-related behavioral health symptoms. So it is cyclic. We notice that substance use is closely correlated with managing those trauma-related symptoms. So practitioners serving Latinx who use substances and who have been exposed to trauma may also manifest symptoms of vicarious trauma resulting from personal histories. So our own lived experiences play a role in how we experience both oppression-based trauma and something called vicarious traumatization. And then literature also tells us that the immersion aspect of our work, meaning that we are fully immersed and professionally and personally committed to this work, as well as the intensity of caseloads and potential lack of preparation in how to identify and treat traumatic symptoms, all may lead to the potential for experiencing long-term effects from oppression-based trauma exposure. Finally, it's important to note that many of us in this work may also be in recovery as well. And symptoms of trauma exposure, again, are correlated not just with substance use, but with risk for relapse. So for one's own well-being, it's important to take a look at some of these things. And I just love this quote. It's really powerful. So this comes from an amazing woman, Audre Lorde, and what she notes is caring for oneself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. So when I refer to radical self-care, I'm really looking to Audre Lorde and so many others in this work in how self-care is framed. And so it's interesting because in preparation, again, for this dialogue, I kind of looked through a lot of different literature, and I kept coming across this prevailing theme that it's important to put oneself first and, to prioritize one's well-being over, potentially other demands on our time or commitments. And I really kind of took exception to that because to me, what Audre Lorde's message here is that we're doing this, yes, absolutely for our own well-being and definitely for our family's well-being. But in addition to that, we're really engaging in radical self-care for the well-being of the collective and being able to address much larger issues such as systemic and institutional oppression. So I was motivated by that to share some of this information with you all. So this may be what it looks like to apply critical trauma theory in action at the personal level. So you'll notice that, there are multiple points of cumulative exposure. That then calls on what we know already exists, this vast wealth of cultural and other identity-based resilience within ourselves, the people we serve in community. So that hopefully will lead to sustainable thriving. But again, radical self-care and healing, it's a deep personal commitment where we have to draw from our cultural and other points of identity, the resilience that comes from that, and then also from our circles of support, which we'll talk a little bit more about, to heal from oppression-based and other traumas through critical self-reflection, mindfulness, and other healing practices. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide, even though, again, I feel like I'm speaking to the choir here. Many of you, most of you have, I'm sure, an immense amount of expertise in this, and so I apologize if I'm going over anything which you may have already known a lot about. But I wanted to create a foundation for some common terminology for us to understand what happens in oppression-based trauma. So, imagine as I'm going through these terms, your workplace environment, or even out in community and community interactions that you have. And while I was doing this, I was thinking back to the time when I was in direct practice. My direct practice experience is primarily serving families and families of color with systems engagement and systems involvement. And at the time that meant child protective services, it meant adult courts and corrections, and as well as most of my work was in juvenile justice, and so going to children's court as well. And I really thought about what was it like to be a practitioner while advocating for the families I served, most of whom were Latino. So I thought about this idea of code mixing and code switching. And so essentially, code mixing is what happens when we're bi or multilingual and we switch between phrases or words to help convey a particular concept. Code switching, however, happens, and it's a lot more nuanced, and that tends to happen when a person is experiencing oppression, where they feel that they're compelled to change from one style of communication to another. And that, if in effect, it alters who we are or how we're expressing ourselves externally. So this happens a lot in what we call white spaces, or spaces predominantly dominated by, the overarching Anglo culture, where it's important, to feel safe and to be able to communicate, navigate through communication. And there's an extra added pressure when we're advocating or navigating communication on behalf of the people and communities who we deeply care about. So I really spent some time thinking about the impact and the energy invested in code switching, and specifically because language and culture are so inextricably linked. A lot of times people reflect that when we're able to speak in our first language, it's the seed of emotion. It's what brings emotion forward for us. And having to change from that on a daily and even, minute by minute, hour by hour basis, it does have some impact on how we perceive ourselves, how we perceive our relationship with community and culture. It influences our worldviews. It even changes the way we think about things. So I wanted to raise that as a significant stressor. It's also very adaptive. I want to also say that many of these are strategies to be able to be adaptive and safe. And so I hope that, that resilience comes through in the dialogue as well. And specifically right now, I'm really wanting to focus on the stress that it evokes. So with that comes the concern of imposter syndrome. And a lot of folks might really resonate with this experience of imposter syndrome in your workplace. So, it took me a long time first to complete any of my degrees. So I'm the first person in my family on both sides to go to college to get a bachelor's degree. And then I think I may still be one of the only ones with a master's degree. And the whole time I lived with this sense of having to overprove myself. And especially when I was in those court settings on behalf of families, really having to feel as if I knew, everything, that I had a strong, immense amount of expertise. And that was a huge point of stress for me. And what I noticed that the sense of having to overprove oneself, how that manifested for me is I would spend hours and hours and hours trying to, research or learn about something or make sure I said the exact correct thing. And I took a lot of responsibility on my shoulders in terms of the outcomes for the families and communities. And it took a toll. So I wanted to raise that as a point of contemplation as well, that others may be experiencing in their work. Now, this one's a really touchy one, and the next one, which is lateral violence and horizontal aggression. And I want to really couch this as a distinct outcome from oppression, and that this is in fact something that is a learned behavior, again, that could be protective and adaptive for people in positions of leadership. So lateral violence and horizontal aggression, this is something that's been widely studied, especially in the field of nursing, but I definitely have seen manifestations of this in social work and other helping professions, where people who directly experience oppression, and especially when they're in that role of leader and feel that they have to be again, have to overprove or have to demonstrate their capacity, the experience of oppression may then bleed into their interactions with people with similar identities. And, you know, it's actually a devastating phenomenon, and one that has been linked to many different negative health outcomes, including vicarious traumatization. So sometimes it's also known as workplace bullying. But specifically, I want to just address what happens at the oppression, you know, at the oppressing, experiencing oppression and then oppressing others. At that level, there is a breach in trust that happens. And, you know, as we look to our colleagues who we hope to have a level of emotional safety with, which is so important in this work. And so we'll talk more about that in a bit. But when that trust is breached, then it leads to a sense of high anxiety and real concern, and again, some negative health outcomes. So I wanted, you know, just to pose that. And there's great news, though, however, out there, some great works happening in restorative justice and the ability for those who have been targeted by lateral violence or horizontal aggression, being able to work through the intense impact that it has had on them through restorative justice circles. So I did want to, you know, share there's some great stuff happening out there. And then microaggressions are, you know, that I'm going to just kind of briefly, that's one that's a little bit more commonly understood. Microaggressions include a wide range of covert and overt acts of oppression. So, you know, this can be anything from a subtle verbal or nonverbal insult. They can be layered insults, and as well as cumulative insults. And again, you know, this often happens really frequently in our daily lived experiences. So there's this cumulative lived experience with exposure to oppression that is subtle. You know, some folks call it mundane, right? It happens so frequently, it's almost a daily, you know, it's considered part of our daily living. And then it can be also hugely dramatic, brutal, and impactful. So there's a wide range of how this can manifest. But what I wanted to bring your all's attention to is this idea of racial battle fatigue. So as we look at lateral violence, as we kind of think through feelings of imposter syndrome, daily experiences with microaggressions, and then something called spotlighting, which is being looked at as either the expert of one's ethnic community or looked at as the only person, for example, who can interpret something. There's so much stress that is given to a person who is targeted by these things that it may lead to something called racial battle fatigue. And when studying racial battle fatigue, a lot of the literature around that is through qualitative research, which is about the lived experiences of the individuals out in community. So it's really rich, and it comes forward with so many stories of really poor health outcomes and devastating influence and impact. So those are, you know, the oppression-based traumatic experiences. I wanted to also link racial battle fatigue with the experience of our own lived experiences, and then going out into community with the people in communities who we serve and see the level of oppression and you know, the dramatic level of oppression that each of the people we serve experiences. We bring that home every single day with us. And so, you know, what this might lead to is a sense of having to keep silent about these phenomena. There can be, not always, but there can be stigma associated with reaching out for one's own support, one's own behavioral health supports, and shame that's associated with that as well. And then, you know, a pervasive sense of feeling fearful that there may be a negative impact either on yourself and your family, or again, on the people who we serve. So thank you for that. And then, okay, so that leads us, we're going to spend just a little bit more time than we normally do for this polling question. So you can select 1 through 7, and I'm curious in community and those who are able to attend today, what barrier to radical healing and self-care resonates most strongly for you? Okay, wonderful. Oh, thank you so much. So this is really powerful to see everyone's lived experiences. So what it looks like is, definitely imposter syndrome is strongly experienced with the participants today, as well as a sense of microaggressions. It looks like microaggressions is our number one. And then we notice also code mixing and switching and spotlighting as well. So thank you so much for doing that. Thank you so much. Okay, so this is what we're conceptualizing as the critical trauma theory approach to radical healing and self-care. And again, I also kind of share this story a lot out in community. I've been doing this work to help folks to think through self-care and what it means for them for a while now, but it really came from a really dear friend of mine, Caprice Pino, and this was 1,000 years ago when I was pretty early on in this work, and we were outside. I don't mind saying that I used to smoke cigarettes, and so we were outside. I was smoking a cigarette, and we had just gotten done with a self-care workshop, and I was, chain smoking outside. She's like, she was smiling at me, and she's like, there has to be something more than just, drink a beer and take a bubble bath for self-care. And that got us both thinking about what does it mean beyond beer and bubble baths to really take good care of oneself. And so that's kind of the long history of what led to radical healing and self-care. So from a critical trauma theory perspective, what we're looking at are 6 intentional actions. And the first intentional action is really about contemplating the impact of colonization on both who we are, our beings, as well as the work we do. And then we're going to look again at Tara Yoso's 6 points of cultural capital to think through what are those points of cultural capital within us that we can leverage to be able to be resilient. And then I hope to share kind of a newer concept, which is vicarious post-traumatic growth. So a lot of times out in community, we hear the term vicarious traumatization. That's the phenomenon that happens when you're exposed to the traumatic lived experiences of the people you serve. But at the same time, we want to honor and acknowledge and always uplift that resilience is always present and healing is always possible. So, vicarious post-traumatic growth, that's a great way to acknowledge that. And then I'm going to share a little bit about intent versus impact, which is an anti-oppression communication tool. I'll share a little bit about mindfulness and radical acceptance, and that's a hard one. So we'll spend a few minutes on that. And then we'll move on to nurturing ongoing practice of critical self-reflectivity. Okay, so this is really drawing from some incredible colleagues, and these are folks, who are Indigenous First Nations, who have been working to decolonize just systems of oppression as a whole. And so we're really drawing from our colleagues in community to look at what in fact is colonization and decolonization. So decolonization is actually 2 things. It's something that's an event that happens, and then it's an ongoing process. So as an event, decolonization is about reaching a level of critical consciousness and active understanding that you are or have been impacted by colonization and are thus responding to life circumstances in ways that are limited and could potentially be destructive. And I want to kind of root that in co-optation. And what I mean by that is, when we experience oppression directly, those things that are points of healing and hope and health for us actually are transformed in ways by the colonizers. And so what this quote, how I read this quote, is that we're impacted by colonization, and now decolonization is about taking back our roots and our histories and our present experiences with healing, hope, and health. And that's a process. It's an ongoing process. So it's about creating, restoring, and birthing, and it means creating and consciously using various strategies to liberate oneself from oppressive conditions. And I want to share that this was drawn from some dear colleagues here in New Mexico and nationally. And at the end of this presentation, there's a pretty lengthy reference page, but there's a link to a whole chapter on decolonization if you're interested to to look more deeply. So here, you'll notice throughout this presentation, I'll just give you some ideas, right? These are just things to think about and ways to start approaching this radical healing and self-care process. And so, building on the model that I just shared with you, I just want us to give some thought over time, and certainly this is not something you need to answer right now, but these are things that both have come up in community and also, things I've contemplated, but the ways in which colonization has influenced and impacted our relationship with our bodies and our identities, as well as our personal actions and our professional actions. And then finally, what do we contribute to globally? So cultural capital, I mentioned this in the last webinar, and I just wanted to share cultural capital can be defined in a lot of different ways. And during the emergence of critical race theory, which is a really powerful theoretical approach to examining everything from the legal system to our education systems to, just multiple institutional and structural forms of oppression, and reframing those to, again, uplift and identify resilient strategies. And so, with us in Latinx communities, how do we notice aspirational capital, which is the ability to maintain hopes and dreams even in the face of adversity? We also look to familial capital, which is the cultural knowledge. So that's powerful. That's cultural knowledge that's given from generation to generation, and it's nurtured among familia that carry a sense of community, history, memory, and cultural intuition. And much resilience and strength comes from that. And then aspect number 3, which is social capital, I wanted to reframe that to look at it from the perspective of something called circles of support. So social capital, folks know about that, and they think about it from the perspective of who can you go to that has resources that can help you in times of struggle, right? But it's also about, what I'd like for us to look at that is look at our circles of support in the areas and spaces where we feel completely safe to be authentically ourselves, right? So if we're enduring oppression-based trauma and we are striving for healing, hope and health, we want to be in an environment where we're actually can be 100% who we are. So that's the idea with circles of support. With navigational capital, that's the ability to navigate or move through institutions and systems that were never created for or by communities of color. Resistant capital, that happens to be my favorite, and I love it because I definitely see this with young people. So my clinical expertise is really in culturally sustainable adolescent behavioral health, but resistant capital is really amazing. So it's, and you see it every single day. It's that righteous, powerful indignation, that power that comes from the skills and knowledge to be able to stand in the face of power and speak your truth. So it's fostered through oppositional behavior that challenges inequity. And the final one is linguistic capital, and that is, known to, I'm sure, most of us here. The bilingual experience actually patterns your brain in a really amazing way and helps to expand problem-solving opportunities. It enhances communication in more than one language. So it's a really powerful point of capital. Okay, so embracing vicarious post-traumatic growth. So this one was really fun to dig into because for a long time, again, both in my role as professor, but also just out in community, kind of breaking down barriers and really challenging people to think differently. Post-traumatic growth was not really ever talked about. Even when I was in my master's for social work, what I frequently heard was this overwhelming sense of like when folks are exposed to trauma, oh my gosh, you know, I've even heard terms like they're broken, or even in the worst situations, I've heard the term frequent flyer, which is a horribly stigmatizing word for people who come into services and then leave and then come in, which is what we know folks need to do in order to, you know, explore their healing process. So it used to make me really angry. And I wanted to really get the word out about post-traumatic growth, which is that it absolutely is true. And we know this, it's absolutely true that when someone goes through a traumatic event, simultaneously they demonstrate resilience. And then not only that, but they continue to show this amazing sense of healing, hope, and health. And I wanted just to share that dominant narrative around the lifelong impact of trauma as being something that cannot be healed from is absolutely not accurate. Folks can heal and can continue to thrive. So, but in addition to that, and this was really powerful. So again, in the references, you'll notice there's a reference for an article about vicarious post-traumatic growth and healing among addictions counselors. And that's the title of the article. And so I wanted to share that, you know, emerging now is this idea that not only are we noticing post-traumatic growth, but it actually helps us as practitioners and people supporting others in healing, that it benefits us to be able to see that resilience. And in fact, there are so many positive things that come from that. So vicarious post-traumatic growth is the experience of renewed hope, resilience, and growth associated with serving populations impacted by trauma. And through our witnessing of their healing and resilience, we're able to, you know, practice radical acceptance, which we'll talk about. We're able to increase our sense of empathy and connection and community, you know, connectivity and commitment to community. We also acknowledge the vast potential for people impacted by trauma and substance use to heal and thrive. It also deepens relationships. It creates meaning associated with witnessing others suffering and healing, as well as positive transformation of our own worldviews. And then finally, it reaffirms our passion for this work. Okay, so I do want to get to our professional strategies, so I'm going to introduce just a few more personal strategies. This is a really important one that I want to share with you, and then again, resources are embedded in the reference page for you to kind of explore this further. This is an extremely powerful anti-oppression communication tool. So going back to those barriers that we face out in the workforce, or, you know, out in community or in our daily lives, there are a number of instances where we kind of think to ourselves, should we address these behaviors? Is it safe to address behaviors that are negatively influencing and impacting us? And when I was introduced to this tool, it helped me so much to feel safer to be able to raise when I noticed a microaggression or an act of racism or an act of homophobia. I was able, to me personally or to others, I was able to stand up and really speak my truth in a way that helped to acknowledge the impact it had on me. So the concept behind this is, you know, we can assume that most people don't start off their day thinking they're going to be hurtful to another person. So we can assume that most of the time people make mistakes or that they have positive intent behind what they're doing, but the impact that they had was not aligned with their intent. And so when you say to someone, I acknowledge and realize your intent was probably positive, but the impact it had on me when you said, you know, something that happened to me not too long ago was, you know, hey, can you take notes in this meeting, a meeting that I was facilitating, you know? So that to me was a clear example of someone who didn't see me as a person capable of facilitating an important meeting. And so in this instance, I might say to that person, you know, I imagine that your intent was to see that this meeting was well organized, but the impact that had on me was you demeaned, you know, my capacity, my capability of being the facilitator for this meeting. And what that does is it speaks the truth. It helps somebody to maybe hear differently how they're behavior has negatively influenced someone else. And it gives an opportunity for us to move past that experience. The important thing to note about this, though, is that intent versus impact is just a tool. And sometimes the breach is just, I mean, over the top hurtful, right? And so if that happens, it's important to understand that sometimes reconciliation is not an option in that moment. So that is a tool that I've used and it's been helpful to me. And next, okay, this leads us to our second polling question. Okay, so radical acceptance, which we'll talk about in the next slide, but I'll go ahead and just speak to this a little bit since our polling question is here. Radical acceptance is a strategy that we can use out in community. And this one was a hard one for me to swallow. It's a belief or a philosophy that there are many things outside our control. And in fact, most things are outside our control. We really have the ability to control, our internal lived experiences, our interpretation of things, how well we take care of ourselves. So our behaviors, our choices, our actions, those are things over which we have control. Radical acceptance helps us to see that in the face of so much, oppression, adversity, challenge, there are some things over which we can't influence necessarily immediately. So what does that do? I know I can speak to myself. Sometimes I find myself in places where I'm experiencing anger for long periods of time, or I sometimes disengage if I'm not feeling safe, or I've been going through a lot. I might find myself isolating or disengaging. But radical acceptance, I like to call it radical acknowledgement. It helps us to really understand that we have the ability to step outside of this lived experience to say, I acknowledge that oppression has occurred. I acknowledge that racism has occurred. And in that acknowledgement, I also acknowledge right now, I may not have the ability to influence it, but I can also say it will not influence me. And so I see that as an acknowledgement rather than acceptance. So back to our polling question, previous slide, please. There we go. So radical acceptance and intent versus impact are strategies that, so would you say, based on the information we just talked about, would you say that these are, ways to validate people's oppressive behaviors as a normal part of living? Would you say it allows people who are impacted by oppression to maintain safety and well-being while confronting oppressive behaviors? Or would you say it excuses personally mediated forms of oppression? So we'll give you a few seconds to fill that out. Perfect. Okay, great. So that message was what was intended. So that people who are impacted by oppression can maintain safety and well-being while confronting oppressive behaviors when that's possible. So thanks for this pause here. So again, we're about 15 or so minutes out from the end of the presentation. And as they're getting ready to flip to the next slide, I just wanted to share with folks that I kind of approach slide decks, and this is awful. I know this is like the worst presenter strategy ever, but I want you all to know that you'll have these slides and all the content in it. And so I may just pull out some key points so that we get through our content. And again, I welcome any questions toward the end, but also a continuing dialogue after this webinar. So I talked a little bit about radical acceptance or acknowledgement, and that can be achieved a bunch of different ways. But if we look at understanding what we can and cannot control in life, that helps to relieve a lot of pressure and stress off our shoulders. Also practicing non-judgment, and that's non-judgment not just externally, but probably most importantly internally. So not judging ourselves for the feelings we experience, for any kind of thing that we might be challenged with. Really approach that with self-compassion. And then looking at just the facts of the situation, that's really nice. And kind of linking back to circles of support, those environments where you can be 100% authentically yourselves. Sometimes I got to take what happened to me back to my folks and just be like, let me tell you what just happened and what do y'all think of that and what is your impression of that? And and gain insight sometimes from my circle of support as well. And that helps me to kind of frame things sometimes. And then noticing too that when we're confronted, when we're being oppressed, that is a painful experience. And it's important for us to understand, to really validate for ourselves that we've created emotional safety for ourselves, that, we're able to be authentically ourselves in certain environments, and that the painful experience will pass. And at that point, you can determine what is safe for you to do once you're facing oppression. Mindfulness also really helps us with this. So mindfulness is just the idea of being able to, again, place non-judgmental attention. So that piece of self-compassion there, placing non-judgmental attention and awareness to the present moment. What's nice about this is it helps us just slow down a little bit. And the main thing the way I wanted to weave mindfulness into radical healing and self-care is that it truly helps us to notice that vicarious post-traumatic growth. It helps us to see the beauty and the deep inspiration that comes from serving the people and communities who we serve. Being able to see others really heal and thrive is powerful, but it's hard for us to do that when we're going from one thing to the next thing to the next thing. So practicing mindfulness helps us to slow down and really notice those amazing positive things. And then we're going to kind of wrap this up with ongoing critical self-reflectivity. So a lot has been said in the literature, certainly, in behavioral health, in substance use treatment, in social work, this idea of reflective practice where, we want to strive to gain a deeper understanding of ourselves in the context of our work. But I'm hoping to press us even one step further, where we take that critical aspect and we really examine our daily interactions with others through the lens of social justice, equity, healing, and resilience. So I just, I want us to root ourselves really firmly in that, not just looking at, did I do CBT well, or, or dialectical behavioral therapy? Did I hit all the, was I evidenced about this? All of that is critical. And in addition to that, there's much more going on in our interactions with other people. So it also helps us in understanding, the way I was raised, how does that influence my work? What are some implicit biases I may still be experiencing, and how can I radically address that? How about some misinformation or partial histories? And then finally, create opportunities for real transformative change through a newly developed understanding. So it's just kind of it's ramping up that reflective practice to be more critical. And these are questions. I'm not going to go through all of these because I really want to get through our final portion of the presentation, but I do want to share, again, if you decide that you really want to embrace radical healing and self-care, these are some questions that you can look to help to, pursue and contemplate and think about. You can even take this to your circles of support and have dialogue around this. It may even be something that you could do at staff training if you'd like. Okay, so we're gonna, wrap this up and give you some pragmatic tools that you can use at work as well, within your work, in your engagement with communities. And so these are some things that I've used in my work that I found to be really helpful. And they're emerging in the literature as being something that's evidence-based, but I would say they're more practice-based evidence at this point. And these are definitely, geared and something I've reflected on in use with Latinx communities and individuals. They're also something I've done with students. So this comes from a lot of heart, and I, again, in this idea of an ongoing dialogue, it would be so wonderful if I could hear from you all out in community, if you've been able to employ any of these strategies, how helpful they were to you. So again, just like our, CTT at the personal level, I tried to kind of show a graphic of how we might rethink through a critical trauma theory lens, the 6 guiding principles to trauma-informed approach. And I'm going to touch on some of these throughout the remainder of our few minutes together, specifically creating emotional, cultural, spiritual, cognitive, and physical safety, earning and building trustworthiness and demonstrating transparency, building out those circles of support, which we've talked a lot about, practicing authentic collaboration, and then disrupting systems of oppression as a collective together. And all of that leading to enhancing and honoring cultural and other identity-based resilience, resistance, and healings. So one of the first tools that I'll share, this is something, again, I did out in practice, but also I do with all the students I have the honor to work with in social work. But I always start off my semester or start off any group dialogue with developing community agreements. And what this tool does for us is it helps us to kind of diffuse some power differentials, and it creates a sense that we're all in this together, that we want to co-construct a safe environment where, it creates a structure for the dialogue, it helps to build trust, and it's a framework also to address conflict if it emerges in that dialogue. What's important to see here is that, we're not developing rules. Rules sometimes aren't really helpful, right? So what we're doing is we're developing agreements with each other. And that comes from posing a critical question, which is, what do I need from my peers to feel safe in being my authentic self? And then you can go around and ask every person within that dialogue to share what they need from their peers. Common things that come up is being respectful, and I always ask a clarifying question: what does respect mean to you? Because respect, may look differently for each individual. Practicing non-judgment, etc. So that's one great way to start, by applying critical trauma theory in your work. So so this critical trauma theory, again, is built off the immense and powerful work in critical race theory. Critical race theory also has LatCrit, which is specific to Latinx communities. It has something called TribCrit, which is written by Indigenous First Nations practitioners out in community. So just know that this comes from a really powerful body of work that's inspired by folks out in community. And there may be some areas that you might be interested in looking at as well. So again, think about taking a look at the reference page, but specific to our work in serving people impacted by substance use, I wanted to think about what would it look like to change narrative therapy up a little bit. So in critical race theory, counter storytelling is a key strategy or a key tenet. And what counter storytelling is being able to, again, speak your truth and challenge societally constructed, deficit-based dominant narratives, which we hear every single day. So that's going to challenge these dominant negative narratives, and instead add the resilience and the thriving that comes from families, communities, from being able to speak our first languages, being able to be free of stigma associated with any status that we have, and again, uplift our sources for resilience, healing, and resistance. And so a specific type of counter storytelling is called testimonial, which is the experience of being able to expose the impact of oppression-based trauma and substance use while simultaneously promoting social justice. This is so powerful. So testimonials can be spoken or they can be written, and it does carry through with an oral tradition. And what it asks the individual to do is to engage in their own critical self-reflection on their lived experiences and their sources for recovery and resilience. And it can be developed, there can be some prompters that you could use. So it can be developed from poetry, and I give you some citations for that. And again, it can replace an aspect of an intake that we have to do for our funders. It can replace an aspect of assessment, or it can be an assignment in a therapeutic group. Oh, this one's so powerful for me, and I'm running short on time, so I probably won't be able to do this justice, but I just wanted to share with you all. So arts-based healing is probably one of the most phenomenal ways, definitely with young people that I have seen, to engage in allowing folks to share their resilience and to just see that vast wealth of hope and healing that emerges. So one arts-based methodology is something called photo voice, and weirdly, it's actually research strategy. And I mention that because photo voice actually can be used if you are, if you have the opportunity to do advocacy with the people you serve, with their consent and commitment to, to be a part of a process. Photo voice can be an incredibly powerful way to show funders, legislators, community leaders, the lived experiences of people impacted by substance use. So I wanted to share that as it's both a healing strategy and also an advocacy or activism strategy. So in photo voice, people are actively engaged in capturing visual imagery through photography that depicts social issues they face. So these are 3 of my pictures, and they're ones that I typically use when I'm doing a photo voice project with a group. So, the first photo up top is this was a mural that was on 57th Avenue in Albuquerque that was painted over. And in that wall, what's not seen in that is there are some areas where there are some bullet holes, as well as that hole in that one brick. And to me, what that just spoke to was this beautiful, rich ability to, both feel hurt and, but at the same time to heal and grow. And then the picture to the right of that, and also to express this lightness and hope. So that's that one picture. The picture to the right of that I just wanted to share is actually Santa Rita down in the southern part of New Mexico. And what's really powerful about that is I just pulled over on the side of the road, and I just, was really moved by the santuario. And in the back, you'll see that there's a mountain behind this image, but it's in fact a reflection on the window between me and the statue. And so, that to me was just this cycle of healing, growth, and resilience. And the final picture there is a sacred space in the northern part of New Mexico near Abiquiu. And this sacred space, I took this picture from the road, and this to me was the ability to bring our traditional, our past, and the power, our ancestral power forward to the future. And so that's what that image connotes to me. And so, I gave you some prompters there to help you to think through how you might integrate photo voice into your work. And so I thank you for allowing me to share that with you. And that has been really incredibly powerful. One of the most powerful things I think is that participants reflect that they're able to see themselves in the work of others and their own sense of identity and heritage and tradition and cultures being able to be reflected in others. And that is a powerful point of resilience. Thanks, Ruth. There we go. Perfect. Okay. So just really important as we're getting close to our questions and answers. I can't believe how quick the time, I always think I have, hours upon hours with you all. And so I try to squeeze a lot in. So thanks for your patience. But this slide here is another professional strategy where we can apply critical trauma theory. And so I share with you some definitions around action styles for taking actions, because our work is as much professional, if not more so personal, but it's also, there's especially right now, a political aspect of our work. So, we have immigration, we have ban the box movements, we have decriminalization. There are so many important things where our voices at the community level and the people we serve need to have pathways for voice on these issues. So here are some really powerful action styles. And the ones I'm going to really focus on are critical allyship, which is when a person acknowledges systems of oppression and then leverages their points of privilege. And this is sometimes hard to hear, but all of us here have points of privilege and disprivilege. If we're able to have voice and we're able to be in spaces where advocacy and activism are possible, that's a privilege. And so how then as critical allies can we open those doors wide for everyone who may not be able to have that voice? So critical allies, we practice cultural humility and engage in continual learning and critical self-reflection. And it does often include confronting people or actions who promote oppression-based trauma. So I also just wanted to share a little bit about my own personal philosophy. I feel like this is like this work right now and for, across our lives is about fighting in solidarity for social justice in resistance against an established system of oppression. And we might look at that as being rebellious or even as being warriors. And so I want to share that because, next slide, please. That's how I frame what's needed to be a critical ally. We'll go ahead and skip that to actually the characteristics. Again, you can go back and take a look at it. Okay, so these are the characteristics. These are things that, again, I've noticed or I've been taught. These a lot are from elders and others in community, my own mentors and my own, I'm getting to be, I've been in this work for a little bit now. And so these are maybe a little bit of my own lived experiences as well. But to be an effective, critical, culturally humble, critical ally, we have to make that radical commitment to our own healing, being authentic, going to our roots, really looking to our roots and our traditions. What do we know about, healing, hope, and health and thriving? Remembering our ancestors and preparing with our children, our grandchildren, and future generations, always in our heart and in our thinking. Incorporating discussions of social equity in every conversation that, you could possibly weave in with your children, but also really wherever we go. Fight for anti-racism and anti-oppression. And then practicing ceremony. And ceremony means so many different things traditionally and then presently for people. This could mean prayer. It could mean meditation. It could mean sweats. It could be this one was something that was really powerful for me for a long while, which was mindful running, celebration, grieving, and rites of passage. And then, be humble, right? And this is, for me, every day is an exercise in being humble and really opening myself up to what do I need to learn and engaging in that learning. And I also can't emphasize enough the importance of being critical, analytical, curious, and also creative. And then finally, when I say collect, I want to be careful about that. What I mean about that is remember the impact stories from the people we serve and the communities we serve in how oppression-based trauma has influences and impacted them, as well as our sources for resilience, and be protective of that. And then finally, stay safe. I always talk about this with my students now. It's important to practice power in numbers and being mindful always of documentation or incarceration statuses, for some of the folks who I work closely with. It's important to acknowledge that they may in fact be on probation. They may be on paper right now. And so that changes sometimes the spaces where they can be their authentic selves and speak openly. And, know your sanctuary communities and your allies. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and surpass this question. I apologize, but I want to really get to our plan before we end for questions. So please switch slides. Thank you. The final slide here for our professional application of critical trauma theory. A lot of the work that I also did when I was really actively out there was doing policy transformation and advocacy. And advocacy again was within systems, which was really difficult sometimes for me. But I really wanted to just for a minute mention the importance in these advocacy spaces. A lot of times they do something called power mapping, and power mapping is figuring out who's got the power and how to leverage that. And I want to introduce a different way to approach that, which is how instead do we, we mobilize together in solidarity? How do we leverage our own personal points of power? How do we invest in those community leaders who should be leading this work? How do we create spaces for voice and choice? So again, remember, we're revisioning the way trauma-informed approach works, even at the advocacy level. So we're trying to enhance that voice and choice. It's not about empowerment. Folks already have power. What we're trying to do is help to create those spaces for them to live through that power. So this is a pathway to power vision, and you can take a look at that. And then, so I'm going to leave us, so we have about 15 minutes for question and answer, and I really appreciate your patience. Again, I hope I didn't speed up too much, but this is some questions that you can kind of contemplate. It's something maybe that you can take to your circles of support, or that you can do again within your workspaces, if that's a safe environment for you to do this. But thinking through, how do you apply critical trauma theory at your personal level? You all are such incredible healers out in community. You have, so much collective lived experience. It's, again, so humbling. And in order for us to stay in this work, we have to practice our own healing. We want to keep that hope alive, and we want to continue to be healthy and thrive. So these are some questions to contemplate, both at the personal and professional level. And with that, I'm going to say thank you so much for this opportunity and for being able to join you all. I also want to wish you an amazing 2020. I really hope that this is a year of healing and of thriving. And so with that, I'm going to turn it all over to you.
That was absolutely beautiful. We are so honored and humbled to have you here today, Anna. That information was just kind of, mind-blowing, but so powerful at the same time. So thank you so much. We actually have quite a few folks who have been expressing their thanks throughout the presentation. So as you were focusing on this amazing information, I just wanted you to know that quite a few people were saying thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was a real honor to be here.
Yeah. And so, one participant in particular, Gabriela Gonzalez, said, as you were presenting on Photo Voice, that her mother's domestic violence testimony was written in a book, and she also presented her story. So she also holds to the belief that giving testimonies helps a lot. And like you said in your presentation, it's so culturally appropriate, and it's something that we've done for generations, that, for us to allow not only ourselves, but also other folks that we, think of in our circle to do this, and those who we might be providing treatment or services to, is just such a powerful thing, right? And it's not something so outside of the realm of possibility. So thank you for that.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing the personal story regarding your mother. And I really feel that it's such a healing opportunity, again, especially in safe spaces. So thank you.
Of course, yeah. So Ms. Cruz Hernandez has a question and wants to know, what are the best methods you have implemented or discovered for engaging Latinx parents versus engaging Latinx youth to understand these concepts?
Oh, I love that.
Stated that it's a bit challenging to pass this knowledge on at times to parents from older generations and youth who do not understand oppression, microaggressions, etc.
Oh my gosh. Well, and this actually doesn't come from, I've had brief experiences. In fact, I had a recent experience. I created a curricula in partnership, though, with young people for substance use prevention. And it is a culturally sustainable curricula that's free. Again, if you're interested, feel free to reach out. But in that experience with those youth, being able to introduce these concepts in a way that resonated and made sense for them, and then for them to kind of use different, poetry or, again, music or some arts-based or mural development, creating murals. All of those opportunities help the young people frame these lived experiences with microaggressions and other pieces in their own terminology and their own symbolism. And how we engage parents in that work is we always celebrated the young people's accomplishments and their commitment to peer-to-peer leadership by bringing, folks to share a meal and to share those pieces of art. And what we saw was naturally through that experience, parents started talking to each other, and it opened up a piece of conversation between the young person and that caregiver in a way that may not have happened in other spaces. So, I think it's challenging. It's definitely challenging. And the only real strategy that I've seen to be effective in my work is doing both a youth and parent dialogue together. So that could be a conversation starter initially. And then I would love to hear from others if you have, because parents are so vital. And I think parents, those barriers that we face, parents face those same barriers as well, and sometimes perceive us as part of a larger system. So, we kind of have to work double time to earn that trust and to create those safe spaces for parents. There's also some references within, there's one specific to photo voice I want to say that's about engaging parents in community using photo voice. So perhaps you could even try photo voice with parents. So, and then I also think of another article that I'll try to remember to send to Maxine. Great question.
Perfect. And so there was a follow-up question about where specifically they could find that curriculum. So feel free to reach out. At the end of the presentation, you'll have not only the ATTC's direct contact information, but also Anna's direct contact information. So feel free to reach out to us, and we'll do everything that we can to follow up with you.
And to share about that curriculum, it's free of charge. It's open source knowledge. It was heavily researched, but it was done in collaboration with young people here, specifically in New Mexico. So young people who identified as Latinx, as well as Indigenous First Nations. So those voices hopefully are well reflected. And I am very open to criticism or, criticism, I mean feedback, right? What's happening out in community and what is or isn't helpful. So always feel comfortable in contacting me.
Perfect, thank you. So Arturo Gonzalez asks, can you explain how you assume that individuals and groups have power given the recent federal policy decisions we are experiencing?
Oh, thank you. So each day we have, first I want to just say thank you for that real and truthful question. And what I want to say about power is sometimes internal and it's intrinsic to our collective, meaning we sometimes have to start at the most basic place, which is our heart, the heart for this work and the heart for healing, and our voices. And when we're able to safely connect with others collectively and in solidarity, there is in fact power in numbers. And I absolutely agree with you that what's happening nationally, it's a human rights violation. I don't have a better way to put it. And it's definitely oppression-based trauma, and it's also oppression-based violence. So I just want to say, we always have to remember we carry with us, we've been raised with the knowledge and the ability to heal. We have voice, and those voices are so critical. We have our lived expertise, and then we have each other, which I think is the most important message in this is we can't do this work without being in solidarity with one another.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you. So Noemi Velasquez has a question, but I also want to say that during your presentation, she showed gratitude for your land acknowledgements.
Oh, thank you.
Agrees that it's really important in the work that we do, especially, with pockets of communities that don't often hear that. So what Ms. Velasquez said is, with all the anti-immigrant and anti-indigenous political climate, it is important to build relationships with allies. One of the things that the older generations do not like are labels like Latinx.
Yes.
I think it's important for people to understand and acknowledge each group's identity, as Latinx is a new term that is not relevant to some groups.
Thank you. You know, and first of all, I'm grateful for the opportunity again to be able to present here from New Mexico, and I'll continue. I've been thinking a lot about my own ways of being able to strive to constantly commit to decolonization, and so I just want to express my commitment from here moving forward to always do my best to acknowledge the Indigenous First Nations communities wherever I am. So that's my personal commitment. And with regard to, you know, this, I guess this question about, and actually, Maxine, can you read the very last part again of the question, and then I'll be able to.
Absolutely. Sorry, it was a stacked question that I gave you.
Yeah.
And do you think that it's important for us to acknowledge and respond to terms like Latinx when it doesn't necessarily fit for everybody?
Yes, thank you so much. Okay, so so this makes me reflect, because we made a commitment to embed Latinx in this dialogue, specifically because of the current generation's very important messages around gender binary and not being constrained to that gender binary. But we had a really powerful discussion last webinar as well about, you know, being sure to respect the folks' ways in which we identify and what that means for us. You know, I might say biracial, I might say multicultural, you know, I might name my identities in a number of different ways, and, you know, and then I want to honor and acknowledge other people's ways of identifying. And so with that, I would say thank you for, again, emphasizing that important point that for elders, that term may not either resonate, and it also might not be respectful. So we always just want to be thoughtful and mindful about what spaces we're in, and always be open to how others choose to self-identify.
Thank you. And yeah, again, we want to refer people back to the previous session in this webinar series, and you'll not only hear, you know, some of that discussion that Anna just spoke about, but also, you know, all of the other amazing information that you provided us. All right, I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Perfect.
So Catarina Zamora asks, professionally, there is so much effort to focus on cultural diversity and not really on the healing. She would like your feedback on possibly seeing these two merged and focus on training of the healing and cultural diversity.
Oh, I love that. You know, that's a really powerful question that it's one's positionality, meaning, you know, what's your standpoint, right? How are you thinking through this work really plays a big role in that. And I think when I think about merging cultural diversity with healing, I think healing should be a part of every single dialogue we have. And, you know, but then at the same time, I also want to honor and again, acknowledge the multiple and amazing and inspirational ways we all identify, and the strength and the resilience that comes from that. So, you know, to me, that ability to kind of share one's authentic self within a collective, it's a tricky thing, but it's super important. And it's where that true resilience and healing begins. One of the things I didn't mention in this, and this is kind of a heavy topic, so I'm going to keep it light, but in solidarity in this work, you all may have, I know that I have in community experienced breaches of trust between communities of color. And when I talk about solidarity, I mean among ourselves, but then I also mean, you know, in other communities of color or in other oppressed communities, in order to confront and combat such a systemized way of oppression, it really does require all of our voices. But what that means is we have to radically acknowledge that there have been some breaches of trust, some hurt and deep, you know, intergenerational suffering that's occurred between communities, and that, you know, that's a strategy for oppression too. So, so I just want to end that comment by saying I think healing should occur in every space. Healing dialogue should occur in every space possible. Folks should feel safe to be able to authentically identify in the ways that we do, because that's really where our sources for strength come from. And then we have to be real and bold about those barriers to solidarity that we might face out in community, and then how do we actually heal from that.
Beautiful, thank you. So folks, unfortunately, we've reached the end of our webinar, but I do want to say that there are a couple of questions that are left here. So look to our website and we will do our very best to post some follow-up information to some of the questions that we didn't get to. I apologize about that. But, you know, we're really excited that we had such a rich opportunity to learn this information. Can we go to the last slide, please? One more. Thank you. Okay, so a friendly reminder, please take a couple of seconds to fill out the satisfaction evaluation. You can use this QR code to access the evaluation. Alternatively, you can wait till the end of this presentation and you will be immediately redirected to the satisfaction evaluation. We appreciate you, Anna. We appreciate the work that you do. We appreciate everyone for attending this webinar and for all of the participation. We hope to see you at our next webinar event. Hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you so much.